This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we spend the hour with MIT professor, author, activist, political dissident Noam Chomsky. Over the weekend, he spoke to a packed audience at the New School here in New York City.
The former Republican Party has now become a radical insurgency that's abandoned parliamentary politics. I'm quoting two highly respected, very conservative political commentators, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute. And in fact, they may succeed in increasing sanctions and even secondary sanctions on other countries and carry out other actions that could lead Iran to opt out of the deal with the United States. That is. That, however, need not mean that the agreement is nullified. Contrary to the way it's sometimes presented here, it's not a U.S.-Iran agreement. It's an agreement between Iran and what's called P5+1, the 5 veto-holding members of the Security Council plus Germany. And the other participants might agree to proceed, Iran as well. They would then join China and India, which have already been finding ways to evade the U.S. Constraints on interactions with Iran. And in fact, if they do, they'll join the large majority of the world's population, the non-aligned movement, which all along has vigorously supported Iran's right to pursue its nuclear programs as a member of the NPT. But remember that they're not part of the international community. So when we say the international community opposes Iran's policies or the international community does some other thing, that means the United States and anybody else who happens to be going along with it. So we can dismiss them. If others continue to honor the deal, which could happen, the United States will be isolated from the world, which is not an unfamiliar position. That's also the background for the other element of Obama's, what's called Obama's legacy, his other main foreign policy achievement, the beginning of normalization of relations with Cuba. On Cuba, the United States has been almost totally isolated for decades. If you look, say, at the annual votes in the UN General Assembly on the U.S. embargo, they're rarely reported, but the U.S. essentially votes alone. The last one, Israel joined. But of course, Israel violates the embargo. They just have to join with the master. Occasionally, the Marshall Islands or Palau or someone else joins. And in the hemisphere, the United States has been totally isolated for years. The main hemispheric conferences have foundered because the United States will simply not join the rest of the hemisphere in the major issues that are discussed. Last one in Colombia, the two major issues were admitting Cuba into the hemisphere. U.S. and Canada refused, everyone else agreed. And the U.S. drug war, which is devastating Latin America, and they want to get out of it, but the U.S. and Canada don't agree. That's actually the background for Obama's acceptance of steps towards normalization of relations with Cuba. Another hemispheric conference was coming up in Panama, and if the United States had not made that move, it probably would have been thrown out of the hemisphere. So therefore, Obama made what's called here a noble gesture, a courageous move to end Cuba's isolation, although in reality it was U.S. isolation that was the motivating factor. So if the United States ends up being almost universally isolated in Iran, that won't be anything particularly new, and in fact there are quite a few other cases. Well, in the case of Iran, the reasons for U.S. concerns are very clearly and repeatedly articulated. Iran is the gravest threat to world peace. We hear that regularly from high places, government officials, commentators, others, in the United States. There also happens to be a world out there, and it has its own opinions. It's quite easy to find these out from standard sources, like the main U.S. polling agency, Gallup Polls, takes regular polls of international opinion. And one of the questions that is posed is, which country do you think is the gravest threat to world peace? The answer is unequivocal. The United States, by a huge margin. Way behind in second place is Pakistan. It's inflated surely by the Indian vote, and then come a couple of others. Iran is mentioned, but along with Israel and a few others, way down. That's one of the things that it wouldn't do to say. And in fact, the results that are found by the leading U.S. polling agency didn't make it through the portals of what we call the free press. But it doesn't go away for that reason. Well, given the reigning doctrine about the gravity of the Iranian threat, we can understand the virtually unanimous stand that the United States is entitled to react with military force, unilaterally, of course, if it claims to detect some Iranian departure from the terms of the agreement. So again, picking an example virtually at random from the national press, consider the lead editorial last Sunday in the Washington Post. It calls on Congress, I'll quote, to make clear that Mr. Obama or his successor will have support for immediate U.S. military action if an Iranian attempt to build a bomb is detected, meaning by the United States. So the editors, again, make it clear that the United States is exceptional. It's a rogue state, indifferent to international law and conventions, entitled to resort to violence at will. But the editors can't be faulted for that stand because it's almost universal among the political class in this exceptional nation, although what it means is, again, one of those things that it wouldn't do to say. Sometimes the doctrine takes quite a remarkable form, and not just on the right by any means. So take, for example, the Clinton doctrine. Namely, the United States is free to resort to unilateral use of military power, even for such purposes as to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, let alone security or alleged humanitarian concerns. And adherence to this doctrine is very well confirmed in practice, as need hardly be discussed among people willing to look at the facts of current history. Well, the Washington Post editors also make clear why the United States should be prepared to take such extreme steps in its role of international primacy. If the United States is not prepared to resort to military force, they explain, then Iran may, I'm quoting, Iran may escalate its attempt to establish hegemony over the Middle East by force. That's what the President Obama, calls Iran's aggression, which we have to contain. For those who are unaware of how Iran has been attempting to establish hegemony over the Middle East by force, or might even dream of doing so, The editors do give examples, 2 examples. Its support for the Assad regime and for Hezbollah. Well, I won't insult your intelligence by discussing this demonstration that Iran has been seeking to establish hegemony over the region by force. However, on Iranian aggression, there is an example, I think one in the last several hundred years, namely Iranian conquest of 2 Arab islands in the Gulf under the U.S.-backed regime of the Shah back in the 1970s. Well, these shocking Iranian efforts to establish regional hegemony by force can be contrasted with the actions of U.S. allies. For example, NATO ally Turkey, which is actively supporting the jihadi forces in Syria. Support is so strong that it appears that Turkey helped its allies in the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front, to kill and capture the few dozen fighters that were introduced into Syria by the Pentagon a few weeks ago. It's the result of several years and who knows how many billions of dollars of training. They did enter and were immediately captured or killed, apparently with the aid of Turkish intelligence. Well, more important than that is the central role of the leading U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, for the jihadi rebels in Syria and Iraq, and more generally for Saudi Arabia having been, I'm quoting, a major source of financing to rebel and terrorist organizations since the 1980s. That's from a recent study by the European Parliament, repeating what's well known. And still more generally, the missionary zeal with which Saudi Arabia promulgates its radical, extremist, Wahhabi, Salafi doctrines by establishing Quranic schools, mosques, sending radical clerics throughout the Muslim world with enormous impact. One of the closest observers of the region, Patrick Coburn, writes that the Wahhabization by Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabization of mainstream Sunni Islam is one of the most dangerous developments of our era, always with strong U.S. support. These are all things that wouldn't do to mention, along with the fact that these pernicious developments are a direct outgrowth of the long-term tendency of the United States, picking up from Britain before it, to support radical Islam in opposition to secular nationalism. These are long-standing commitments. There are others, like UN Ambassador Samantha Power, who condemn Iran's destabilization of the region. Destabilization is an interesting concept of political discourse. So, for example, when Iran comes to the aid of the government of Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan in defense against the assault of ISIS, that's destabilization. We have to prevent it, if not aggression, perhaps. In contrast, when the United States invades Iraq, it kills a couple 100,000 people, generates millions of refugees, destroys the country, sets off a sectarian conflict that's tearing Iraq and by now the whole region to shreds, and on the side increases terrorism worldwide by a factor of 7 just in the first year. That's stabilization, part of our mission that we must continue for the benefit of the world. Actually, the exceptionalism of U.S. doctrinal institutions is quite wondrous to behold. Well, going on with the Washington Post editors, they join Obama's negotiator, Obama's Clinton negotiator, Dennis Ross, Thomas Friedman, other notables, in calling on Washington to provide Israel with B-52 bombers, and perhaps even the more advanced B-2 bombers, and also huge, what are called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker busters informally. There's a problem. They don't have airstrips for huge planes like that, but they can use maybe Turkey's airstrips. And none of this is for defense. These are not defensive weapons, remember. All of these weapons are offensive weapons for Israel to use to bomb Iran if it chooses to do so. And since Israel's a U.S. client, it inherits from the master the freedom from international law. So nothing surprising about giving it vast supplies of offensive weapons to use when it chooses. Well, the violation of international law goes well beyond threat, goes to action, including acts of war, which are proudly proclaimed, presumably because that's our right as an exceptional nation again. One example is the successful sabotage of Iranian nuclear installations by cyber war. The Pentagon has views about cyber war. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an act of war, which justifies a military response. And a year ago, NATO affirmed the same position, determined that aggression through cyber attacks can trigger the collective defense obligations of the NATO alliance, meaning if any country is attacked by cyber war, the whole alliance can respond by military attacks. That means cyber war attacks against us, not by us against them. And the significance of these stands is, again, something that it wouldn't do to mention. And you can check to see that that condition is well observed.